We are recording. This is Service APIs meeting. Go ahead, Jeremy. We're going to be talking about L4 and how it relates.
Awesome. All right, so sharing the KEF, this is kind of the draft we've thrown together. So I think basically thinking a lot about layer 4 and what can go in TCP route / UDP route as, you know, as theoretical routes. I think basically where we got to is that the things that probably fit there most are still kind of in early stages in Gateway in general. The examples that we kind of came up with were traffic splitting. Definitely seems like something you'd want in a TCP route. And session affinity could also be a good thing, like as more of the gateway-ish type concepts from service move up to gateway and to routes. Those things seem like they'd naturally fit on a TCP route. But unless you're configuring those things, a TCP route would essentially be a kind of dummy placeholder that a user would need to create without really any value, right? Like the exposed ports are basically defined on your service already. And if you have to create a listener, you're basically mapping a listener to a service port when you want to, you know, define your load balancer. So what value does a TCP route actually add? And then taking that a step further, a service kind of essentially becomes it's just part of the routing chain. It's the terminal link, but you know, if you think about like the routing chain is gateway to HTTP route to service. If we replace HTTP route with TCP route and TCP route doesn't do anything, maybe it should be optional. And so maybe to start, we can just have gateway select services and just basically map a listener directly to a service port. And that's kind of where we got here. So basically thinking that you define your listener on your gateway, and then when you want to associate a route, you basically just have labels on your service, like we've been thinking about for HTTP route. Now, this kind of begs a question of, does this mean that a route selector needs to match all resource types, or at least multiple resource types, and it needs to be context aware? Like sometimes it matches HTTP route, sometimes it matches service. Even if we went TCP route, UDP route, we'd have to match that as well. So thinking about possibly adding a type to the route selector, so you can actually specify the kind of resource that you want, with the idea that I can't really think of a situation where you'd want to mix and match HTTP routes and layer 4.
Yeah,
this is interesting. Sorry, go ahead, Andy.
Oh, thanks, Boy. The primary three parts of the proposal is that we would just leverage the route selector as per documented in the Service API's book. You know, routes can be of different types: HTTP, TCP, IP. This is a route of type service. And then just use the same mechanics with a label selector. And then the important distinction between what I'd previously been doing with service routes is that we still require the listener definitions, because Jeremy convinced me that that's useful even with the service being the terminal and only member of the route chain, because you may only want to expose specific ports on the service via the load balancer. So the listeners are what define what ports to expose. And this
yeah, I was going to ask.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask, given the previous proposal where we kind of wanted to make the common config like super tiny in terms of defaulting, or where you guys were going with that, but I think that answers my question. One thing that would be good is to work out if people can write really strange configurations based off of this, and if we can very clearly define how those would be handled.
Well, this is specifically to handle this configuration. This is acknowledging that we're in a position with routes and route composability that is not exactly clear. There has been a preference towards API or as UX with the HTTP route. And we actually raised a question later on if routes are actually intended to be truly composable. And so this is saying, well, like HTTP route, it can be a composite, right? It doesn't require the other routes. So this is how do you introduce L4 at the MVP, the lowest, the fewest possible changes. And this introduces L4 to the Service API project in a way that any controllers reconciling gateways could support forever, right? Because in the note about, if you scroll down, Jeremy, I think there's a note about the endpoint slices. No, I guess it's up. Yeah, it's oh yeah, the endpoint slices. So Jeremy pointed out that the reason that we deem TCP route and UDP route unnecessary for basic support today is that, well, services and endpoints already provide all the information. And while I pointed out, because Jeremy had always viewed that the target of a route would be service and not endpoints. And I thought, well, why wouldn't it be endpoints? I said, you don't really need the service. And he said, but with endpoint slices, you do. And so since we know service is going to be around for a while, it's not going away anytime soon. This pattern that would be required to be supported by any controller implementing the services API provides a very low bar to support L4 with existing types. While still allowing future iterations with more composable route chains.
Yeah, this is an interesting proposal. One sort of question would be, like, can we precisely define what everything a user could write ends up meaning? Because a lot of these APIs have some strange corners. Like, would something be ambiguous in terms of just working through the consequences of setting it up like this?
Well, I think some of that ambiguity comes from the fact that today you assume it's an HTTP route. And that's what Jeremy touched upon briefly with if you scroll back down, Jeremy, the resource type. I didn't know you were going to add that, but I'm glad you did. Because today we kind of assume HTTP route, but there actually isn't any assumption. And without that assumption, I think that is really the crux of a lot of the ambiguity. Because even if you have a truly composable route chain, if I had a gateway today without the group and resources in the route selector, right? I don't actually know what my first route is supposed to be in that chain. And I heard that a recent meeting, there was a conversation about adding a forwards to a listener. And I actually think that would be good to have an explicit, like a linked list, like the first node of that list for the first node of the route chain. But without being explicit about the first member of that chain, you're going to necessarily introduce ambiguity. And I always thought that was the purpose of the route selector, to say, like, we don't want to be prescriptive here. One controller.
That's right. That's right. That is definitely the intent, is to have a class of types that you can go to next. What I mean more is that, let's say we do this, make sure that we can work through all the possible different configs that the user can generate, and check that we have a deterministic sort of meaning for them, or they will be invalid. Like,
so there is, Jeremy, if you scroll down, there is a section on error handling, for example, like duplicate port errors.
Yeah.
So this would support multiple services as service routes, and it documents that if there is if a route matches multiple services, and two of those services both define port HTTP at port 80, or the same name or same port, then that would be an error on that listener and saying, hey, nope, sorry, duplicate port, right? So there is the possibility of introducing error states, but that's what would be reported as part of the listener status.
Right, and then that raises a good question. Like, so that is also potentially a realistic scenario that you actually want, right, with traffic splitting. So you actually want to match two services, but that's where you'd probably need something like a TCP route that provides additional configuration, because you probably don't want, random 50-50 selection.
Right. Yeah. So the questions that come to my mind are, and I'm not saying that you don't have the answers here. It's just like which fields on service are relevant, which are sort of like not ignored somewhat. For example, like type load balancer probably is not relevant to the
Right.
rest of the things.
Yeah.
Do we want to make it so like you can't you have to have a type of either less than cluster IP, like none, I guess, if you wanted to attach a service in this given way to make it less ambiguous to the user?
That would be implementation
like basically,
specific, though. Like,
I think we need to talk.
Control. Go ahead. Sorry.
I think those things need to be, at least we need to sort of run through all these cases just to make sure that people don't get confused.
Right, and there's some interesting edge cases, like for certain load balancers you might actually need like node port services.
And others you wouldn't. If the load balancer framework is also tied into CNI, you don't need a node port because the load balancer could route directly to the pods, which is why I was saying it would be implementation specific of the controller.
It would be good to kind of collect all those cases to basically be able to we have like a clear kind of conformance / API behavior, because the thing is we're composing something that's new with something that already exists, and the thing that already exists in this like kind of complex ecosystem in some sense. We just need to work through all the details to see that the user can't get into trouble, or at least easily get into trouble when they're describing things.
I think it's really weird to want to document the what is it called, the unknown, figure out the unknown unknowns, right? The document the absence of things.
I don't think we necessarily need to go into detail on every possible permutation, but I do think it makes sense to show like the things that we just talked about as like kind of weird scenarios, like when you need node port, when you don't, what happens with like load balancer, what happens with external name services, like those don't make any sense at all in this context. So like I think a few examples doesn't hurt to kind of show that.
Well, that's fair, but I think in each of those cases, the answer is going to be it's up to the user and the controller to make it work with whether it's subject additional names and the certificates. I mean, the actual contract that we're defining is very simple.
I think it would help though. Sorry.
It would be good to see what the contract is. So where am I coming from? Is that we have a couple of user stories, and they are, again, I'm not saying that, I think this is an interesting idea, and we should definitely look at it to kind of figure out if we are going to get into trouble, because we can change aspects of at least the gateway part of the API. Is like, could we get any, are there any ambiguous things, right? Are there configs that we feel like are valid that the user is going to write and get it wrong? That kind of stuff. So that's why being a little bit exhaustive is useful here, just so that we don't end up, I'll give you an example. In network policy, I think the API was designed for a long time, and then there was, people found there was a need to basically have a tri-state instead of a Boolean, right? And at that point, it was pretty, basically they needed to do some kind of fancy footwork to kind of get that back into the API. I just want to, when we are connecting things together, to understand that the fields are going to be well-defined. And users can't have a strange corner case that, I mean, as a controller author, you're going to discover that anyways, but it would be good to understand that from an API standpoint.
Right.
So basically be able to account for it.
And another thing I think that might be good too is like there's a lot of fields on service, and so my understanding here, I guess, good background from my state of mind is like service continues to be useful as a endpoint aggregator, basically. And you need an endpoint aggregator at the end of a route chain. But lots of the fields on service don't really make sense with gateway, and gateway can take over for some of them. Like we mentioned potentially session affinity. So it might be good for us to just kind of add in here the fields that do matter still. Like we can.
Yeah, like it seems like there's like definitely going to be overlap. Maybe we can define a subset that are like going forward, these are the ones that matter if you're using it with gateway, and then the other ones, you can set them up, but like gateway won't be looking at them, because then it really shrinks kind of the set of possibilities that we have to kind of sort of figure out what the semantics are.
Right. The session affinity example, if we said that TCP route, whatever that ends up being, as we continue to evolve, how that fits, if we specify that that's going to be on TCP route, then we can just say that is ignored when set on service, for example.
Yeah, I think we're solving two different problems here. Because if we were talking about a TCP route instead of this concept of service route, I don't know we'd be having the same conversations. And really, we're just removing it. There's an implied connection. I think the other conversation is important to have. Lord knows I've had it with Nikita and Jeremy and Rob and Bowie, to some extent you as well. Bowie, I always forget. But like, how much at what point does fields on service get added to gateway? Because everyone understands that service is a little overloaded today. And I'm concerned we're setting the bar on this to solve that problem, and I think they're two different problems.
I guess what I'm saying is I'm constraining your problem. So if we say that there's like very few things on service that we actually care about and we're actually going to look at, then it's much easier to define how that and gateway works together. If we don't do that, my fear is that people will have an expectation.
Okay, that right there, that's the key. Okay, now it makes sense. You're worried that somebody setting something on service will imply it automatically works for gateway. Okay, that I get.
Yeah, exactly. Like if I set load balancer and then somehow people think that load balancer is going to be the same as the gateway load balancer. Like,
do you have that concern today
for as much as possible?
Do you have that concern today for HTTP routes? Because isn't the terminal point of a route a service? So is there some expectation today you're worried about if somebody said something on a service that it's going to impact how the gateway API behaves?
So that one is, it is a concern. Although the cost has already been paid, because we basically on the HTTP side, the expectation is sort of aligned with how ingress behaves with service. So in some sense, it is not well defined in terms of like service never wrote down explicitly what that means. But and probably now is the time we should write it down.
So that's what I'm saying. Like
this is where this is more tangible as an issue is that, for instance, you're mapping to a service, but the listener and port need to align with the listener and port on the service. Which one? How do you do the selection? What if you select multiple services and they have different ports and so forth? Like that's where that becomes an issue. And then the other one is if you are talking about L4 and there's session affinity there right now, how does that propagate back and forth? On ingress, I think some controllers propagate session affinity, some don't. That's sort of like a mismatch on how it can behave, and we should just let's just define it. I don't think this makes your task any harder. I think it makes it probably easier if you just at the outset say.
I think I agree. I just think it should also be maybe a blocker for this or handled separately. I think the idea of defining the relationship between the properties on a service related to ingress and load balancer with respect to the gateway API is an important and necessary task. And it sounds like it was just kind of punted for HTTP route, and we're seeing it's due to various reasons. There was some implied things and things we didn't consider yet. But I mean, I'm fine saying like we can't do this until we do that. I just think that let's not necessarily think about it in the context of this, because it could hide it could hide edge cases that we haven't considered. So we should actually think about that as a separate task. Like, what is this relationship? Does it change how gateway is defined, how listener is defined? Because one of my notes to Jeremy was, it feels like a lot of the changes here are happening use case by use case versus looking at the way just networking and routing rules, like well-defined definitions of those things work. And if we implemented it based on that, then the use cases should be easy to implement. But if we implement it use case by use case, we get into a situation where it becomes, I think, more difficult to retroactively make changes that, or changes that we make for new use cases could have far-reaching effects or side effects that impede other use cases.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you. The use cases are sort of used to kind of, they're like points in the space, right? And then you're talking about, you know, what is the overall shape of the space. I think this, like, you're going to have to kind of define it anyways. So, and the task might not be as difficult, given how we have an existing model. And
you are paying attention to the wrong thing, sir. There's clearly something more important going on your side of this phone call.
Yes, there's a rock somewhere in the backyard.
Oh my goodness, rocks in the backyard. Those are very important. Don't discount rocks in the backyard. I have an 8 and 6-year-old on rocks right now. I wish it was just about rocks anymore.
I guess what I'm saying is, like, I think you're going to have to do that anyways as part of this proposal, and that might be not as difficult.
Yeah, I agree. So actually, Bowie, you raise a really good point here. Like, what is the expected behavior if two HTTP routes match all the same things?
Yeah, so we're working through that. If it's conflicting, that's an error. At least the current proposal is that if they are conflicting, where we have to define what conflicting is, then it is an error, and that will be flagged to the user in status. Okay, so it's definitely the case that the user can create situations where there's conflict. As soon as you have route selectors, you're going to have conflicts. Now, I think we should explicitly say that, like, that would be one thing that in your definition, that instead of, so for example, I'll give an example. One of the ingress controllers, I forget which one, if you have, maybe it's not an ingress controller, but some of these systems, like if you select multiple services, it basically interprets them as like spread traffic evenly among them, which could be a natural way to do it, but it's like a behavior that we definitely need to kind of nail down.
Right. If you wanted to do that specifically, that's great. If you accidentally did that, that's terrible.
Yeah, so precisely. So that's kind of where I'm getting at with the API definition is, one is if we're selecting service, let's just figure out what the narrowest fields on service that are relevant are. And then based on that, I think the rest of your task in terms of defining the API will just be a lot easier.
What I'm really
hearing is probably a silly idea, but would it make sense instead of using service to use endpoints or endpoint slice?
That's what I said originally, but Jeremy pointed out that the service is going to be necessary when we start using endpoint slices. I forget your other reasoning, Jeremy, because I did think it would forward to endpoints directly.
So yeah, like you could select endpoints, but endpoints are created, well, and eventually endpoint slices, which there will be more than one per service that are already selected based on the service. So being able, like, it seems confusing to select the things that are created from a service when the service exists, because now you've got this kind of indirect mapping. But the reality is you want everything that's related to a service. So you could have the mechanics be,
for example, you might need node port. You actually might need the node port,
right?
Which is defined
so you might
on the
need
service.
that. There might be some service specific thing that you need there. But yeah, if you like, the way you would have to select endpoint slices would probably, the only like generic way you'd be able to do it is to select the label service name equals the service that you want, which just seems like it feels wrong. Whereas selecting the service, like you add the label for the service, and then you select the endpoints / endpoint slices for that service, and you know regardless of version it'll work.
So one thing.
Yeah, I mean, my major take on this is that endpoint slice is pretty low level, and as a low level construct, it is much easier to get, especially if you have to select over multiple endpoint slices. It's much easier to get a situation where there's going to be inconsistent settings on them. For example, like the set of ports is just really different between them and all. So if you select on service, at least there is that one unifying thing at the top that is like there's one thing there as opposed to n, and that will make it much easier to talk about in terms of rules. Your logic and your controller is going to be much cleaner, I would imagine. Like we've had this experience where if you take.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so usually you want to, if you have an aggregating resource, is to point to that thing rather than the pieces that make up that aggregate, because there's less, like you have less guarantees about those, like all the little pebbles than the big bag of pebbles.
Yeah, and the little pebbles derive their information from the service, right? So if you have conflicts, debugging will be much easier if you can just take your label selector and find the services matching and say, oh, ports conflict, easy, versus having to go through a potentially large number of endpoint slices.
We did discuss.
I get the labeling argument. That makes complete sense. I'm just, if you target the service, your controller is ultimately going to have to look up the endpoint to get the endpoints anyway. So I'm not quite getting that point, but I get the labeling point. Yeah.
Well, it will only end up looking up so I've implemented this, by the way. We have actually, the concept of a service route is interesting because we've already implemented it at VMware. And I wasn't originally proposing this as a service route. It was, let's figure out TCP route. And Jeremy was like, well, we should figure out L4. I said, you're right. So we talked about this, and I think he liked the idea of this. And so one of the things I've learned with implementing it is that, yeah, you have to look it up anyway, but we had the notion of indirect and direct service routes, and they're backwards from what you think, or what I would think people would think. But direct would mean essentially a selectorless service. The endpoints are essentially the IPs that you want to load balance, the backend IPs, whereas indirect would be the endpoints are probably the pod IPs that were selected by the service selector, in which case you're probably actually looking up the node IPs of nodes that are condition ready if there is a node port in play. So you still have to have the service for the node port if you're not going directly to the pods. And we haven't talked about it, but this is called the service API. But one of the real nice values of the services as they are today is selectorless services. And you can use this to load balance things other than services. Which is why I originally thought of going directly to the endpoints. But even with selectorless services, you can still achieve the same thing. And to me, that's an important use case.
Yeah, I think like if you do it on service, you can get endpoints and endpoint slice. If it interoperates, it hides the operational switch between the two. Otherwise, if you define it directly on endpoint, like it just expands kind of the set of things that you need to define.
Sure.
So
we'd also
feels more natural.
Yeah, I agree. We also discussed having a controller, like a core controller and service API repo that would synchronize the listeners on a gateway. If there was a service route detected, it would synchronize the listeners on a gateway with the service ports if none were explicitly defined, so that for people that wanted the one-to-one port mapping, they didn't have to redefine things. And that you could leverage something like that as a migration path for going from where we've got all these fields on service that you mentioned that eventually probably make more sense as part of gateway, but we know that they're going to have to exist in both places for a while. And at one point, we're going to have to make a decision like, well, do they live forever on service? Do we deprecate these at some point and say you define them as part of gateway? That controller could synchronize those.
I think too with that question, so that's a really good question, the point to bring up. Like what is the goal here? And kind of the assumption I think has been that eventually those gateway-ish parts of service become gateway, right? If that's the case, then in the meantime, are they defined in both places? And if they're defined in service, are they expected to continue to work like they do today? Or do we just say, if you're using gateway, you stop using those?
Yeah, it would be great for you guys to just spend a little bit of sort of open, maybe it's in your open question section.
Probably not. We wanted to get the proposal.
Yes, we have no open question section. That's coming from today.
Yeah. We just wanted to get the proposal in a place where people could start to iterate on it. But the CAP is not, in the state to submit it, right?
So I know that I've been talking a lot. Would like to hear. There's a ton of people on the call, so any other voices would be great.
I'll just say thanks for putting this together. I like where it's headed. I think there's a real purpose for this. I see the value in it, and I don't have many criticisms or anything like that. I think Bowie's had some good feedback. I don't have much else to add other than thank you. So.
Oh yeah. This is not criticism. I'm just things to think about to make the proposal.
Sorry, I wasn't meaning that.
Yeah. There's nothing wrong with criticism. There's nothing wrong with criticism as long as the end goal is to help people solve a problem. Criticism along the way just helps us navigate that path a little bit better. The only problem with criticism becomes when your goal is to not help somebody, but just to pick apart what they're proposing. And I've never questioned whether yours or Rob's goal, Bowie, is to actually help. So there's nothing wrong with criticism. Jeremy, on the other hand, can just shut. No, I'm kidding. Jeremy's
fine. One thing I'll mention, James had a good proposal yesterday that we talked about in office hours that involved moving route selector into listeners. I think that's fairly, that doesn't really get in the way of this. It would change a couple things, but I see the same approach working just as well with that.
Yeah, I don't know if that really changes anything, honestly, as long as, I still think, what does everybody think about adding the type, resource type to route selector?
It's interesting because I think we could have a meaningful default, especially in this world where route selector, we already know the protocol involved, then you can have a pretty sane default of if it protocol is HTTP, then HTTP.
Yeah, that's what I meant by my comments about narrowing the scope, because if you narrow the scope, then actually I think that could be very well defined.
I mean, I would think that the gateway class would actually be a great place to define allowed route types or whatever. And that way, if I know, for example, like the HA proxy controller doesn't support these route types, but it supports these others, because then you can programmatically say like, oh, I've got a gateway that's selecting these routes, but the class to which this is connected can't supply those routes. Because right now,
I guess what I meant is that if you narrow the scope, then you would know what possibilities you would need, and that would help define the defaulting behavior. Does that make sense? Like, one of the things that in this proposal is to make it so that the common case is going to be super tiny and people can easily understand and write that config with the defaulting behavior. It would help if you constrained what the input is on the service side for the defaulting.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think one of my concerns is, which is related to this, and also just a broader concern is today, if Jeremy had removed the resource constraint, you may very well have HTTP routes, TCP routes, traffic split types that match that selector. And even if you just say not allowed types, but I expect the first route in this chain to be this, and then everything else is determined by the forward twos, right? But like, you kind of need to know for that gateway what that first route is. And as far as a listener, I don't even necessarily think that you need a selector. It just, there'll be a forward to on the listener. And if the first one is a traffic split, that's one. Or it could forward to a HTTP route, that's the other. The selector is great because it allows flexibility, but it does beg the question of what happens when you have those conflicts.
Actually, that raises a really good question. What, so I've always been thinking that routes are composable, but I actually, rereading the API and where things are at, is that really the case? Like, can an HTTP route, for example, forward to another HTTP route?
Yeah, composing we haven't gone to and discussed it, so that's probably why there's very little verbiage there. The idea is to put some kind of delegation model, delegation in terms of delegating composing things, but I don't know if it's a super duper use case to make it like 100% composable. And you can imagine what a mess you could end up with. Like,
right,
you know, you could have like 10 chains. Does anyone really want to create something like that? And then what would it? It'd probably be a nightmare to understand if you created such a thing.
Yeah.
So right now, if you look at it as sort of a known, is my audio okay?
Yeah. You are coming in and out of robot.
So as currently defined that we have discussed, there's basically, it's sort of like two-level right now. There was a sketch for composability from the HTTP standpoint, and that conversation still needs to happen. But as it's defined, we see that most of the use cases will be satisfied by having this two-level, the gateway with the listeners as a sort of a focus point for talking about exposing things, and then sort of controlling how it's exposed, and then potentially a routing, which is, it looks like in the services case, maybe that can be elided with some sane default, and then sort of the services. So it's like 1, 2, 3 pieces. Number 2, it looks like in your proposal, maybe it's redundant. But you know, with traffic split, that's definitely something needs to be there.
But traffic split's an example of where, like, I feel like we should either buy completely into composability and say a listener necessarily goes to an IP route, then a TCP or UDP route, then a TLS route, optionally then HTTP, and each one of those routes handles what they're supposed to handle, or we end up with what we have, which is HTTP routes, kind of a composite of a bunch of things. And a TCP route could composite in support for splitting and not really require a separate traffic splitting route. I feel where it gets confusing is where we start to say it's composable, but each route is also a composite of these different features. And composite doesn't preclude composability, but now I'm asking myself, well, so the TCP route supports some type of splitting or weighting based on these inputs, but there's also this discrete traffic split route. Should I be using that? And that's where I think it can become confusing. And I understand why it was done. It's this notion of, I keep repeating this, but API is UX. And that's why I said it.
Oh, yeah, so that traffic split, actually, there's a discussion that to kind of remove that object.
Oh, I know. I linked that. I linked that below. But Jeremy, can you see if it's in alternatives? I think I linked that because I found that it's an.
We have this object here.
No, it's in alternatives. There's an issue down below. Yeah.
Yeah. So traffic split, we are now sort of consensus is moving towards trying to figure out if we can sort of put that back up into the per protocol route objects, because people will want to split traffic based on protocol appropriate, for example, matching. So that one we are working through. So I would expect that at this point, traffic split probably will disappear, and instead it will be in the route level, which that completely motivates having a TCP, IP, whatever thing there, because that is something that is completely missing from Kubernetes services today.
Right.
Yep. Now dealt with that. The other thing missing is, you know, knowing whether an IP is. Never. I'm not going to get into that. I have a whole set of opinions about it. But so we took way more time than I intended with this, probably than Jeremy intended. I think a lot of good discussion. My ask is going to be to have people start to look at this, add comments, please. Dane, I know that I had invited you to please contribute because you had filed a PR that, I don't know if you saw my previous PR, but they could be twins, right? They're very similar. And I don't think this precludes a TCP route later. But it's just to really handle that very common MVP case of, you know, if I just want load balancers for an existing service, an L4 load balancer for an existing service, what's the easiest way to get there?
I think, though, that in terms of design, we should, in defining behavior, you know, one of the ways languages and specification is successful is like sort of rewriting constructs to a smaller set of constructs. So, like, one of the things is to say that the pointing directly to a service is a rewrite into a TCP route that has like nothing in it but pointing to the service. And then you can define it in terms of that TCP route and the gateway and so forth. Because that one is a lot easier to deal with than to say there's a separate case for service, there's a separate case for TCP route. And then, like, kind of, I would try to avoid that situation.
Yeah. So even if there's no TCP route, we treat it as though there is an invisible empty TCP route, and then define all the behaviors based on that.
Yeah. I mean, every listener, if the route points directly to a service, then you're basically saying, what are the defaults for a TCP route? And that would, I mean, that's actually another way to think about this, right? I think y'all said something like that earlier, Dane. So I really, I'm going to find you and rope you to a chair and make you work with us, because really, like, what we need to figure out, what are the defaults for the TCP route, because they probably make sense as or UDP, right, as the defaults for this. And if we think about this as there's this invisible TCP route, then we also can help figure out what the defaults are for TCP route.
Yeah, and I have a PR that's out there for TCP route. It's gone through a couple iterations. It was out there a while ago.
Yeah, I mentioned that. I'd said that I'd opened one a while back and closed it because I didn't like that it mentioned the name of the listener, but that was when I thought the gateway was a load balancer, not a virtual server, as it were. So I probably would have left it open had I known that. But it's just like yours almost. We had the same type names and everything else. And it used SNI for host name matching as well. Yeah. I think I pinged you on that and pointed you to this KEP and asked if you would collaborate. So I don't know, maybe I imagined that, or maybe you missed it, but I would love to have you to look at this, please.
No, absolutely. This is the first time I've had a chance to put eyes on it, and I'm starting to provide some comments, and so yeah, just need some time to digest it.
Awesome.
Okay, I think we are pretty much at time, but if there's any other comments on this call.
You know, the other thing I would say, one of the things on the agenda we didn't quite get to yet was how service APIs and multi-cluster services interact. I have a doc that's work in progress that I'm hoping to share out later today that for comments and thoughts, and we also need to discuss TCP in that case as well. So yeah, that's coming. And then also, as I alluded to earlier, there's an interesting PR from James that I think could use some additional, all PRs could use additional feedback. But James' PR could potentially affect this as well with moving what's in listeners around a bit. So that's all. I think that's everything. Yeah, we are at time. So unless there's anything else, maybe we should go. Yeah.
This is great. Like our agendas are very full, and I'm sure we'll have other discussions.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, this has been great.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, have a great rest of your day.